Ever since humans developed the ability to share stories with one another, we've meshed it with one of our biggest fears, the end of the world. Think about it, genuinely. How many times has the world supposed to have ended in your lifetime? I mean, think about it. Because I did, and I came up with 8 separate times. The world should have ended 8 separate times in my 16 and a half years alive. And I've probably missed a few if I had to guess. This question made me wonder, how many times has the world been on the brink of annihilation? So I decided to ask people. So the original plan for this segment was to have a compilation of random people answering, but everyone who didn't immediately shut me down didn't want their faces shown on video, but the answers I did get followed a simple pattern. The older the person answering, the higher the number. After asking people of every age I could, that got me thinking again.
Really? You thinking now? That's big.
How long have these stories been around for? So I dug up my old Catholic upbringing and consulted the Bible. And my God, has anyone actually read this thing? Why do we teach this to children? Anyways, in the Old Testament alone, you can find 3 separate incidents of world-ending events. 4 if you want to argue Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So, again, I started to think, how has the apocalypse, specifically the post-apocalypse, been represented in fiction over the past 2-ish centuries across every medium, from books to movies to video games? So, I don't think I need to tell you where this is going, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. As odd as it may sound, the idea of the modern post-apocalyptic fiction novel hasn't been around for as long as my introduction made it sound. Yes, we've been fantasizing and romanticizing the end of the human race, but the idea of a mass plague wiping out most of humanity is more recent than most people would think.
About the deadly coronavirus officially hitting the U.S.
But across the world, dozens were falling ill with a mysterious virus that would ultimately change life as we know it.
We have a new name for the coronavirus. The World Health Organization has officially called it COVID-19.
Okay, not that recent, but within the last 75 years or so. Before that, the post-apocalyptic story was known as an after-the-fall story, usually taking place after a big war between 2 major countries.
Sirens blaring in western Japan as North Korea steps up its barrage of missile tests.
Again, not that recent. The first post-apocalyptic novel can be traced all the way back to 1826, a 479-page monster called The Last Man, which was written by Mary Shelley 8 years after she, fundamentally at least, created the science fiction genre as a whole, with her smash hit Frankenstein's monster.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
The book follows a man named Lionel Verney, who is the adopted son of a poor nobleman. The story was set far in the future, 2073 and 2100 to be exact, and follows Lionel as he recounts a story of fighting in a war against the Greeks and the Turks. The war leads to society breaking down and follows Lionel's struggle for survival. The idea of a post-apocalyptic story format would remain the same over the next several years. A lone survivor, typically a veteran, struggles to survive after a massive war that would destroy society. In my personal opinion, cyberpunk, raypunk, steampunk, and all of the punks really and dystopian genres formed out of many ideas that the post-apocalyptic subgenre had started, such as the idea of overreaching government, which is most predominantly seen in stories like 1984 by George Orwell and Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. I have no actual basis for this claim, other than it's just a pattern I've noticed. After some large event that threatened humanity or civilized society, overreaching and reactionary government systems were implemented and eventually took hold of people as a whole. Now, when I keep bringing up old and ancient books, I'm not saying that post-apocalyptic literature has gone extinct. Far from it. Stephen King, who is one of my personal heroes, has dipped his toes into the genre with 2 distinct works. The 176-page novella The Mist, and the 1,152-page behemoth The Stand, both of which tackle 2 distinct forms of the apocalypse. The Stand follows the, especially recently, more typical viral infection breed of apocalypses, while The Mist takes a more Lovecraftian approach to the end times. Let's break down what each term means, or really what I mean by each term, because I'm really making these things up on the fly. The easiest one for me to explain is viral apocalypses, more commonly known as the zombie apocalypse. However, that can be misleading, as not every viral apocalypse is created equal. Yes, books like World War Z by Max Brooks, who, on an unrelated note, gave an excellent speech to the U.S. Naval War College about his views on zombies and how they're one of the most personal monsters. If I say anything more about it, I'd just be plagiarizing, and considering the fact that the script of this video started off as an essay for school, I don't think that would be a great idea, so instead I'll link it in the description. The viral apocalypse can take many forms, aside from zombies. But let's be honest, it's mostly zombies. The Stand, however, is a notable outlier. This virus outright kills the host soon after infecting them. We can probably attribute this to the fact that The Stand was originally published in 1978. Yes, modern zombies did exist in movies such as the Living Dead series, but The Stand was published, in the most part, long before zombies were the cultural powerhouse they are today. The Mist, on the other hand, focuses on more of a fantastical apocalypse, the likes of which were being explored several decades before The Mist even hit shelves in 1980 by H.P. Lovecraft, who was the pioneer of these kinds of stories. With works like The Call of Cthulhu and At the Mountains of Madness, these stories followed human protagonists faced with monsters from beyond human comprehension, or simply elder gods from other dimensions. The Mist is an interesting case, as it blends Lovecraftian horror and in my opinion, niche subgenre of the apocalypse, where the main characters are forced to stay in place and observe the world fall apart. Movies such as The Night Eats the World, The End, and Splinter are fantastic examples, and in my opinion fit this niche subgenre better than any novella ever could. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and we'll touch on those in a bit.
To wrap up this section, let's take a look at comic books. Just stay with me now. I'll make this quick, I swear. The idea of a post-apocalyptic long-running comic book had never really been done until 2003. Well, successfully, anyways. In late 2001 or early 2002, a young Robert Kirkman had continuously pitched the idea of a zombie story to comic legend Todd McFarlane, known for founding Image Comics and creating now classic characters like Spawn, and basically starting the movement of self-published comic books. McFarlane kept shooting down the idea over and over and over again until one day when Kirkman was driving him to the airport. He decided to pitch the comic idea again. McFarlane tried shooting him down another time, but Kirkman pitched the idea of using the first 5 issues of the 6 he was asking McFarlane to fund to tell a zombie story, before then pulling the rug out from under the reader by telling them that the virus was started by aliens, and then using the new series to bridge to different Image properties. And after issue 6, readers could go back and find all the hints from the previous 5 issues. Of course, those of us who have ever read The Walking Dead know that this never happened. Kirkman lied to his boss because he knew he had a golden idea. Post-apocalyptic video games are much easier to talk about, especially since video games as an art form wasn't really a thing until the home console boom of the 1980s, when games began to have actual stories rather than just gameplay. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with these old-school arcade games. In fact, my dad saw to it that I was raised with Galaga. But as it turns out, one of the earliest examples and one of the best examples of post-apocalyptic video games is Fallout. And I know, I was just as surprised as you are. While researching for this video, I figured that the first real post-apocalyptic video game would be some obscure text-adventure game from the early 70s, similar to Zork, but more hopeless, I guess, maybe? I don't know. One thing I feel I should note is that I considered including Zork in this section, but I decided against it because I think it falls more in line with medieval and fantasy games of the time, like Colossal Cave Adventure, rather than games like Fallout. Fallout is a post-apocalyptic role-playing game set in a future Ray-Punk-style version of a post-nuclear war America. And it's way more fun than it sounds, I swear. Fallout, a post-nuclear role-playing game, was released in 1997 after being developed by Interplay Studios, a small American-based game studio out of Beverly Hills, founded by Brian Fargo and Rebecca Heineman in 1983. When they released Fallout in early October 1997, it looked a lot different than the Fallout games of today. The developers over at Interplay had meshed gameplay mechanics from tabletop games like Dungeons & Dragons and early dungeon crawlers, and used these mechanics in a post-nuclear Americana-filled setting, which, even after looking at all these post-apocalyptic games today, is a unique and interesting choice. The game sold well enough to warrant a sequel, and almost exactly a year later, on October 20th, 1998, Fallout 2, a post-nuclear role-playing game, was released to the public. While sales were good, Interplay was struggling financially, and eventually in 2005, Interplay sold off all of its IPs and closed its doors. While Interplay as a name is still around today with a surprisingly active Twitter account for some reason, they sold all the rights to the majority of their titles back in 2005, including Fallout, which they sold to a small game company. You may or may not have heard of them. Their name is Bethesda.
16 times the detail.
Yes, today Bethesda is one of the biggest jokes in video games, even with some of those popular franchises under their belt. There are so many different tangents I can go on. In fact, while going over the script with one of my friends, he left the call before we even got down to this part because I talked for over 20-ish minutes about something that's not even in the script. And also, it was 4 in the morning, so sorry, Charlie. I know you're not going to watch this. But I digress. Before Bethesda took over the Fallout franchise, the game was more of a niche experience, played by many, beaten by less. There's a great video series by a YouTuber I've watched for the last several years named Up Is Not Jump about the Fallout series, which as of writing is still going on. I'll link this in the description for those of you who might be interested. For those of you that aren't planning on doing that, the short of it is the first 2 Fallout games are clunky with a capital C. You're bombarded with a bunch of numbers and dials and just so much military OD green. After Bethesda bought the rights to the Fallout series, they managed to widen the audience. You can name several different factors, and if I'm being honest, too many to list in this video. With the success of the Fallout franchise, more studios began releasing post-apocalyptic games, including the one I want to highlight next, which is Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl. Taking place, of course, in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, I say this game is semi-related to my last point because Stalker came out a long time before Fallout 3. But given the setting of the real-life irradiated Chernobyl exclusion zone, it's hard not to notice some sort of similarity. Developed by GSC Game World, at the time small Ukrainian-based game studio, it was easy for them to take one of the most tragic events of their history and make it into one of the most influential post-apocalyptic games of all time. The next game I want to highlight starts with another small European game studio, Techland. Techland is a Polish game studio founded by this man. I'm not going to say his name for fear of grossly butchering it and bringing down the whole wrath of Poland on me. In early September of 2011, Techland released their debut first-person zombie survival RPG, Dead Island. Dead Island is an interesting case study of the post-apocalypse, specifically because 2 factors that, in my opinion, are the biggest reasons a post-apocalyptic story can be a success or flop miserably: setting and cause. Setting is an important factor in any story, regardless of medium or genre. Well, yeah, some of the most successful stories of all time are set in modern day. Just look at games like Heavy Rain or movies like Black Swan. Yes, each of these movies are set in a fictionalized version of the modern day, as vague of a term as it is. However, these are completely different stories, thanks in part to their setting. Heavy Rain is a story about a grieving father doing everything in his power to save his son, who the mysterious origami killer has kidnapped before it's too late. Meanwhile, a detective, a journalist, and an FBI agent... Oh my god, that sounds like a setup to a bad joke. Meanwhile, a detective, a journalist, and an FBI agent simultaneously work to try and identify said origami killer, taking place in a fictionalized version of Philadelphia. The high-reaching skyscrapers and gray undertones of everything cast a long and oppressive shadow on the story to help define the choices we make. Whereas Black Swan, a story about a passionate ballet dancer who is threatened by a newcomer for the lead in the ballet The Black Swan, as you would expect after hearing that description, the movie mostly takes place on stage or in a practice room. Both of these settings work in a similar way, casting a long dark shadow over our characters, making them, and subsequently us as the audience, or players, feel almost claustrophobic. You hear this in almost any writing class or video essay to treat a setting like a character. And that's what all the examples I've brought up so far do flawlessly. Cause works in almost the exact opposite way from setting, as you really only need it in a post-apocalyptic story. Cause is exactly what it sounds like. What caused the apocalypse that the characters are now trying to battle their way through. This is your Maze Runner Cranks or your Mist from The Mist. But the idea of cause is multifaceted. You have your surface level cause for the apocalypse, as I've already mentioned, but below that lies another question. What caused your cause? Going back to my Mist example, we are given pretty clear hints fairly early on in the movie's runtime with lines like this.
Guys from the base.
From up the mountain?
Uh-huh.
The Arrowhead Project? Well, you're a local. Any idea what they do up there?
Missile defense research, you know, I'm sure you've heard the stories.
Dead Island covers both of these things beautifully. Looking at setting first, it's in the title. Dead Island takes place on an island. Go figure. The game takes place on the fictional island of Benoi, located south of the equator but just north of Australia. This small tropical resort/vacation island becomes home to a deadly zombie virus, which brings me to my second base, cause. Again, Dead Island nails this just flawlessly. The dev team at Techland usually tried and tested evolving / different zombie types popularized in games like Left 4 Dead, only a few years before. The way Techland made their generic zombies stand out was by incorporating a real-world virus known as Kuru. To keep this video safe for work, I won't delve too deep into Kuru, but you're more than welcome to Google it for yourself, but I don't recommend it unless you have a strong stomach. To give a quick breakdown, Kuru is a rare disease caused by an infected protein found in brain tissue that causes, according to Healthline, which I'll link down below, muscle twitching and a loss of coordination. As you may have guessed, the only way to contract Kuru is to cannibalize the brain of a dead person. Naturally, this made for great content for a zombie game. While the real-life Kuru won't turn you into a zombie, it makes for some great content. Another game to come out around this time that I also think is worth a highlight is actually an adaptation that I thought about covering in the last section. That game, of course, being Metro 2033, developed by former Stalker developers at a new studio, 4A Games. After being disgruntled by the leadership at GSC Game World, several programmers and other developers left to form their own studio. I don't want to get too much into the creation of the Metro games today, but there is a channel you might have heard of named Reykjavik, and the guy who runs it made an excellent video on the series and the creators itself, which I'll link down in the description with all of my other sources. The Metro series deals with its setting and cause flawlessly. The setting of the Metro games was, again, as you'd expect, Metro tunnels. The setting itself was inspired by the train tunnels of the Russian author's youth as Dmitry Glukhovsky. A quick side tangent. While looking up the name of the author to make sure I spelled it right in the script, a news article popped up about Glukhovsky being wanted by the Russian government. So as it turns out, he's wanted for spreading fake news about Putin. So to avoid being wanted by the Russians myself, I'm just going to continue on with this video. As I was saying, Glukhovsky spent a lot of time in metro tunnels, as it was his primary form of transportation. Eventually, he began to realize that the best nuclear bomb shelter was the train tunnels that he traveled through for multiple hours every day. He began writing what would then become the first Metro novel while in high school. After completing it, he found trouble with finding a place that would actually publish it. The main concern people had with his manuscript was the decision to kill off the main character in the second act. After not being able to publish his debut work, Glukhovsky began to rework his novel. As he did, he published it on the internet one chapter at a time. After the video game adaptation was released in 2010, despite its flaws, it managed to surpass the stereotype of jank that Middle Eastern companies had a habit of releasing. So far, all of the games and books that I've talked about, I've had somewhat of a personal connection with. But this next one is special. In fact, it was the first video game that I ever bought with my own money at the ripe old age of 8. I purchased my very own copy of Telltale's The Walking Dead for the Xbox 360, and I loved it. And if I think about it, it may be the thing that kickstarted the obsession I supposedly have with zombies and post-apocalyptic fiction. To keep this brief, Telltale's The Walking Dead, which I'll just call The Walking Dead to save a little bit of time, was born out of an almost last-ditch attempt to save the company from bankruptcy, while the studio's previous games, Back to the Future the game and Jurassic Park the game, sold okay. And depending on who you ask, okay might have even been a stretch. The point is, the studio was suffering and they needed a new property. Enter a hit new TV show, Frank Darabont's adaptation of a hit comic series. Telltale saw an opportunity and licensed the books for themselves. However, instead of releasing the story that the comics and show had, Telltale went in a different direction, instead choosing to focus on a different group of survivors. The game sold amazingly, partially thanks to its episodic format, teasing the players at the end of every chapter.
Tune in next week for the exciting conclusion, Woody's finest hour! All right, next day!
This tactic worked, and Telltale fought its way out of near bankruptcy and began to license other properties from larger companies. Telltale would continue to release games in the Walking Dead series until it closed its doors in 2018. The End of the World is a 77-minute Danish film released in 1916 and is widely believed to be the first post-apocalyptic story put to film. Directed by August Blom, to quote the IMDb page. And yes, I'm citing IMDb, there's not a whole lot out there about this movie. A comet passing by Earth causes rioting, social unrest, and major disasters that destroy the world. And that's about it. One thing that I did find was that the reason this movie performed as well as it did in the days of Charlie Chaplin was because of a real-life scare that people had with Halley's Comet just 6 years earlier in 1910. People worried that the real-life comet would pass with the same disasters and unrest that the fictional one did. And that's all I can really say about this movie. Yes, this movie is available for free on YouTube, but I can't really speak, read, or generally understand Danish. But if someone's interested enough, I'll link it in the description. The War of the Worlds is the title that I debated on covering in the first section about books. This was because the movie that was released in 1953 was an adaptation of the 1898 H.G. Wells novel of the same name and plot. This movie is the exact opposite of the last one. It's in English, and I've actually seen it. The basic story is, and this time I'm quoting from Wikipedia, not IMDb. In Southern California, Dr. Clayton Forrester, a well-known atomic scientist, is fishing with colleagues when a large object crashes near the town of Linda Rosa. At the impact site, he meets USC Library Science instructor Sylvia Van Buren and her uncle, Pastor Matthew Collins. Later that night, a round hatch on the object unscrews and opens. As the three men standing guard at the site attempt to make contact while waving a white flag, a Martian heat ray obliterates them. The United States Marine Corps later surrounds the crash site, as reports pour in of identical cylinders landing all over the world and destroying cities. 3 Martian war machines emerge from the cylinder. Pastor Collins attempts to make contact with the aliens, but he is disintegrated almost immediately. The Marines open fire, but are unable to penetrate the Martians' force field. The aliens counterattack with their heat ray and skeleton beam weapons, sending the Marines into full retreat. The War of the Worlds changed a lot in the way we perceived the post-apocalypse. We stopped seeing the apocalypse as something man-made. With War of the Worlds, the idea of the end of the world wasn't so foreboding. It wasn't a cloud hanging over us saying, this is what could happen if we don't change. The best way I can describe it is the post-apocalypse went from propaganda to another genre. It wasn't a warning anymore.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
Now it was, ironically, an escape. People began to use the idea of society breaking down as a way for them to be able to get out of the rut they were stuck in, whether that was their family, their job, their school, or what have you. To me, the movie that capitalized on this best was George A. Romero's 1978 smash hit Dawn of the Dead. We're jumping forward a little bit, yes, but Dawn of the Dead is a sequel to Romero's first feature, Night of the Living Dead. Dawn, which is what I'll call it for short, has an opening that I think demonstrates what I'm talking about perfectly. We open in a hectic newsroom several days after the zombie outbreak. People are still trying to cling to normalcy, aside from Francine, who decides to leave while she still can. She understands how pointless her job is right now. No one is turning on their TV to see what's happening anymore, thus kicking off the story. She left her unfulfilling job to take on the post-apocalypse firsthand. Dawn wasn't the first zombie movie, or even the first zombie movie from Romero, but it was the first that heavily leaned into escapism. Zombie movies nowadays are a dime a dozen, but when George Romero made his first feature, Night of the Living Dead, it was a new genre. So much so that George Romero thought he'd actually invented a new monster. Having borrowed from Haitian folklore, which he was surrounded with in his early childhood, because of his father, Romero took the idea of zombies, which, up to this point, were just depicted as mindless servants rather than flesh-hungry monsters we know today, and turned them into the powerhouse at the box office that they are. A dropout and film geek, Romero gathered his friends and family, and some locals who were willing to be zombies, and made the movie for a low budget of $114,000, which, when adjusted for inflation, comes out to be just over $1 million. This doesn't sound like a low-budget movie by any means, but when you consider the sheer amount of manpower it took and takes to make a movie, it starts to make more sense. The best way I can think to put it into perspective is when you go to a movie today, look at how many names scroll by after the director and stars. It's a lot. Now double the amount of people that work on the camera alone, and you start to understand my point. After Night of the Living Dead was released, it made waves. Not only in the film industry, but it made waves for African American activists. What a lot of people seem to forget about Night of the Living Dead is that it came out only 6 months after MLK was assassinated. Having a black lead caused a big controversy. In fact, some theaters refused to play the movie because of Dwayne Jones playing the lead. However, that wasn't always the plan. Similar to Ripley being played by a woman, Sigourney Weaver, in the Alien movies, the role of Ben in Night of the Living Dead was never written to be played by a person of color. He wasn't written with any race in mind. Romero simply wanted the best man for the job, which happened to be Dwayne Jones. Movies and the film industry as a whole have always been a place for social and political commentary, and have always had an impact on the way we view specific issues, so much so that even the Nazis recognized this and created film after film that was just pure propaganda. So when the Cold War began, the threat of nuclear annihilation was something that occupied a portion of everyone's mind. Kind of funny how history can repeat itself. The reason I bring this up is that the post-apocalyptic storylines, more than any other, have to deal with inclusivity and social justice. The best supporting evidence I can give to my argument comes from Adam Marcus, who directed Friday the 13th, Jason Goes to Hell.
I think horror movies, more than any other genre, need to be inclusive of everyone. Race, creed, color, sexual orientation, it all has to come from us.
Yes, he was talking about horror as a whole, rather than just the post-apocalypse, but the point still stands in my opinion. Post-apocalyptic stories are a mixing pot. People from all backgrounds are forced to stand together, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. There are two recent examples that I can draw from in the film Zombieland and the film 2012, which itself was referenced in Zombieland, but anyways, both of these movies follow a surrogate family who is trying to get to a safe place. In Zombieland, the goal is to get to a Pacific playland. In 2012, it's to get to the ominously named and confusingly named ships. Both stories have people from all different backgrounds forced together on a long journey. In 2012, it's divorced parents and Russian diplomats, and in Zombieland, it's an alcoholic, two sisters who are also con artists, and according to the alcoholic,
you're a peppy little spitfuck, aren't you?
If you can't tell, these stories mean a lot to me. They've molded me into the person I am today and influenced almost every facet of my life, from my writing style to even how I talk to people on customer service. And no, I'm not kidding. Feel free to let me know what you thought of this video in the comments below, and I'll let you get back to the rest of the garbage on this channel if you want.